Dawn, the 23rd of May, 1944. Low mist hangs over the Liri Valley in central Italy, blurring the jagged silhouette of ruined farmhouses and shattered orchards. The ground is already scarred with shell holes, tangled wire, and the black lines of anti-tank ditches. Somewhere beyond the haze lies a name printed in red on German maps. The Hitler Line. In a forward German command post near Aquino, field telephones begin their morning routine. Reports of movement, tracks clanking in the distance. Canadian guns testing their ranges. The line has been carefully prepared for this. Concrete bunkers, interlocking machine gun positions, belts of mines laid out in cold geometry. But as the sun lifts, the plan on paper starts to lose its shape. A rolling barrage walks forward across the valley floor. Canadian infantry rise from their start lines, following the curtain of fire in practiced bounds. Engineers move up with them, already cutting, probing, marking. Tanks grind toward the gaps that are supposed to take hours to open. Within a few brutal minutes, German officers hear the first unsettling messages. Canadian troops are closer, faster, and in greater strength than expected. The unbreakable line is about to be tested. When Allied troops first attempted onto Italian soil in September 1943, the plan had seemed simple enough. Knock Italy out of the war, push up the peninsula, force Germany to divert troops from other fronts. But by early 1944, that clean arrow on the map had turned into a slow, grinding climb through mountains, rivers, and fortified lines. The first great barrier was the Gustav Line, anchored on the ruined abbey of Monte Cassino and the crossing points of the Rapido and Garigliano rivers. Through winter rain and bitter cold, British, American, French, Polish, Indian, and other Allied units hurled themselves at the German defences. Each assault left the same pattern: courageous advances, heavy casualties, and then the terrible realization that the line still held. The Germans had chosen their ground well. Steep slopes, narrow valleys, and stone villages gave natural strength to machine guns and mortars. Every house could become a strong point, every terrace a trench. For months, the Italian campaign seemed frozen, an expensive stalemate far from the headlines of the coming invasion of northwest Europe. But while the Gustav Line was the visible front, German engineers and staff officers were already thinking one step ahead. Behind the Gustav positions, in the broader floor of the Liri Valley, they were constructing a second belt of defences. Anti-tank ditches carved into the earth, concrete pillboxes sunk low and camouflaged into fields, long rows of dragon's teeth and minefields designed to channel attacking armour into killing zones. This deeper system would be known to the Germans as part of the Senga Line, but to the Allies it carried a more striking name: the Hitler Line. It was not intended as a last stand. It was a delaying wall. The idea was simple. If the Gustav Line was ever forced, withdrawing formations could fall back into this second network of positions. There, with prepared bunkers and overlapping fields of fire, they could halt the Allied advance again, buying precious days or weeks. Time for reserves to arrive, time to reorganize, time, above all, to keep the road to Rome closed a little longer. In the spring of 1944, as Allied planners prepared a massive coordinated offensive called Operation Diadem, they knew that breaking the Gustav Line would not be enough. Somewhere beyond Cassino, another barrier waited for them in the Liri Valley, one whose true strength they could only estimate from reports and reconnaissance photographs. To understand why Canadian troops were chosen to smash a key sector of that barrier, we need to see how they entered this campaign, and what the Germans thought they would face when the guns finally opened on the Hitler Line. By the time the final plans for Operation Diadem took shape in May 1944, one formation stood out on the charts of 8th Army headquarters: 1st Canadian Corps. These were not fresh, untested troops. The 1st Canadian Infantry Division and 5th Canadian Armoured Division had already fought their way through the broken streets of Ortona, the winter mud of the Adriatic coast, and a series of lesser-known ridgelines and river lines that had fallen out of the headlines, but not out of soldiers' memories. They had learned the hard way what it meant to attack prepared German positions, and what happened when infantry, armour, artillery and engineers failed to work in harmony. By spring, that learning had begun to harden into method. Under 8th Army Command, Canadian staff officers studied air photographs of the Leary Valley and the Hitler Line in meticulous detail. Every visible bunker, trench and anti-tank obstacle was plotted. Intelligence summaries combined aerial imagery with prisoner interrogations and reports from Italian civilians who had watched the line taking shape. The picture that emerged was sobering, a continuous chain of strongpoints, particularly dense in the sector near Pontecorvo and Aquino, where the valley narrowed and the ground favoured defence. Into that sector the Canadians were directed. For German commanders on the other side of the valley, the Canadians were not an unknown quantity. Reports had filtered back from earlier battles in Italy, describing their stubbornness in defence and persistence in attack. They were noted for their heavy use of artillery, their careful preparation before major assaults, and the growing skill with which they combined infantry and armour in close country. Respect, however, did not equate to fear. On German situation maps, the Hitler Line was still the main character. Concrete, steel and geometry were expected to do most of the work. Anti-tank guns were dug in to cover the most likely avenues of approach. Machine gun nests were sited to sweep the open ground between patches of cover. Minefields were laid in depth, not simply as a tripwire, but as a series of belts designed to slow any advance to a crawl. In war diaries and staff estimates, the expectation was clear. An Allied assault against the line, however determined, would be channeled, broken into pieces, and forced to pay for every 100 metres. If the attackers managed to force a breach at all, it would come after prolonged fighting, with high casualties and little immediate opportunity to exploit success. For the Canadians, the same terrain and defences told a different story. They saw the danger in the open killing grounds, but also the possibilities in small folds of ground, drainage ditches and ruined buildings that could offer covered approaches. They planned for engineers to work almost shoulder to shoulder with the leading infantry, for artillery to lift and shift with precision, for armour to surge forward the moment a viable gap appeared. Both sides believed they understood the coming battle. The Germans trusted a line of concrete and wire to buy them time. The Canadians were preparing to prove that time could be taken away with speed, coordination, and hard-earned experience. On the morning of the 23rd of May 1944, those two assumptions would collide on the floor of the Leary Valley. In the hours before first light on the 23rd of May 1944, the Canadian assault troops waited in the orchards and fields west of the Leary River. The ground under their boots was already churned by previous movements. Tracks pressed into the soil showed where tanks and carriers had passed in the night. Somewhere ahead, across a shallow rise, lay the first belts of wire and mines of the Hitler Line. For the infantrymen of 1st Canadian Infantry Division, this was not their first approach march toward a fortified position. Many had come through the street fighting of Ortona, the cold, wet lines on the Adriatic, and a succession of smaller but equally dangerous obstacles. They knew what waited between here and the objective, mines that could blow a man apart without warning, machine gun bursts that could cut down a section in seconds, mortars that seemed to land wherever men tried to gather. Their kit reflected that experience. Wire cutters and Bangalore torpedoes were checked and rechecked. Marking tape for cleared lanes was ready. Platoon commanders moved quietly from group to group, confirming orders, pointing out landmarks barely visible in the gloom. The plan depended on timing. Follow the artillery barrage close enough to reach the enemy positions while defenders were still stunned, and dugouts not yet fully manned, but not so close that short rounds would fall among the attacking troops. Behind them, gun positions were packed with Canadian and detached Allied artillery. Every battery had its fire plan laid out to the minute. Lifts, shifts, concentrations on likely strongpoints. The infantry knew from bitter experience what it meant when artillery and infantry were out of step. On this day, the aim was to keep the two in lockstep from the first step off the line. On the far side of the valley, German officers watched the same landscape through a different lens. Their defensive diagrams showed arcs of machine gun fire crossing the open ground. Trenches and bunkers were sited to cover one another. Anti-tank guns waited for the moment when Allied armour committed itself to a particular route. On aerial photographs pinned to headquarters walls, the Leary Valley looked like a problem already solved in advance. Choke points identified, obstacles laid, killing zones prepared. In many of their estimates, the Canadians and their Eighth Army neighbours would have to pause repeatedly. Mines would slow them. Confused infantry would lose the timing of the barrage. Tanks would hesitate at ditches and fields of dragon's teeth. Each pause would give the defenders time to recover, man their positions fully, and bring down artillery. On paper, the Hitler line was designed to turn an assault into a series of disconnected, bloody fragments. In the pre-dawn of the 23rd of May, the question was simple and unforgiving. Could Canadian troops, with their hard-learned methods and their supporting arms, keep the attack moving fast enough that the line never became the static killing ground the Germans expected? For the German defenders, the Hitler line had been built around a certain image of war. Infantry pinned in the open, tanks trapped by ditches and concrete, attacks broken apart by carefully layered fire. But by May 1944, Canadian and other Eighth Army units had turned the problem back on them with a different kind of machine. One made of guns, radios, and engineers as much as rifles. The most obvious component of that machine was artillery. In the hours before the assault, Canadian and attached Allied batteries were laid out in depth behind the start line. Field guns, medium artillery, and heavy pieces each had their place. Fire plans were drawn so that the barrage would not simply smash a single enemy trench and stop, but walk steadily forward across the Hitler line's outworks and main positions. Defensive bunkers, likely observation posts, suspected gun pits. All were assigned concentrations. The intention was not to destroy every strong point outright. That was rarely possible. Instead, the barrage was designed to blind, stun, and disorganize. Observers forward with the infantry, and in some cases in aircraft overhead, would be able to call for adjustments. When a particular pocket of resistance held out, guns could be switched quickly, delivering short, violent storms of shellfire that cleared the way for the next rush. Above and beyond the barrage, air power added another layer. In the days leading up to the assault, fighter bombers and medium bombers struck at known gun positions, crossroads and reserves. On the day itself, aircraft flew armed reconnaissance and close support, ready to hit targets that emerged as the battle unfolded. Even when they were not bombing, their presence complicated German movement and communications. Any attempt to shift reserves in daylight risked drawing attention and attack. Closer to the front, armour and engineers carried the burden of turning firepower into movement. Canadian tanks, many of them Shermans, were not expected to charge the line unaided. Their crews knew what German anti-tank guns could do at typical Italian engagement ranges. Instead, armour was integrated into the plan as a partner for the infantry. Where engineers cleared lanes through minefields and anti-tank ditches, tanks would follow, using their guns to suppress bunkers and machine gun nests that had survived the initial bombardment. For the engineers, this meant working in conditions that combined precision with constant danger. They had studied models of the Hitler line, learned the likely patterns of wire and mines, rehearsed how to mark cleared paths with tape and lights. But when the attack began, all that preparation would be tested under direct fire. Every mine lifted, every bundle of explosives placed in a wire obstacle or at the lip of an anti-tank ditch brought a little more speed for the troops behind. Communication bound all of this together. Forward observers with radios, line crews repairing brakes, liaison officers moving between headquarters. They ensured that the artillery did not fall behind the infantry, that tanks did not wait too long at a gap, that support weapons were brought up in time to hold what had been taken. The Hitler line had been designed on the expectation that attackers would slow and falter in front of it. On the 23rd of May 1944, the Canadians intended to strike it with a moving front of steel and coordinated arms, fast enough that the line would not have time to become the stable defensive system its designers had imagined. When the guns finally opened in full on the morning of the 23rd of May 1944, the Liri Valley ceased to be a quiet strip of farmland and became a moving wall of shock and dust. The opening barrage rolled out in carefully timed waves. Shells marched forward in fixed lifts, striking the outworks of the Hitler line, then the main positions beyond. German observers, those who survived the first minutes, found their view choked by smoke and dust. Telephone wires snapped. Positions that had been neatly plotted on range cards disappeared behind drifting curtains of earth. Behind that wall of fire, the infantry of 1st Canadian Infantry Division stepped off their start lines. Sections advanced in short rushes, keeping as close to the barrage as training and nerve allowed. The ground was broken, cut by ditches and scattered with debris from earlier fighting. But the plan demanded pace. The closer they stayed to the creeping fire, the less time German machine gunners and mortar crews would have to recover and man their weapons in full. Almost immediately, the obstacles began. The first belts of wire appeared as shadowy lines through the smoke. Engineers moved forward with cutters and prepared charges, clearing narrow lanes and marking them with tape and pickets. In some places, Bangalore torpedoes were slid under the wire, their detonations punching jagged corridors through what had been drawn as continuous barriers on German maps. Beyond the wire lay the minefields. Here the tempo of the assault was most at risk. Every pause to probe, every moment of hesitation was time the defenders could use. Canadian engineers, working in teams under covering fire, probed and cleared as quickly as they could, often resorting to widening lanes that had been started in earlier, limited advances toward the line. The result was not a smooth advance, but it was a continuous one. When one company stalled, another edged forward through a different gap, keeping the attack from congealing into a single vulnerable mass. As the barrage lifted off the front line of bunkers and moved deeper, the first intact German strongpoints came into view. Concrete pillboxes sat low to the ground, some disguised with rubble and vegetation. Machine guns opened from slits that had survived direct hits. In certain sectors, these positions inflicted the kind of punishment the line's designers had intended. Men cut down in the open, stretches of ground that became killing zones. But this time, the attackers did not simply stop in front of them. Canadian infantry used smoke, fire, and small manoeuvres to close in. Some strongpoints were engaged frontally with supporting fire from mortars and machine guns. Others were skirted and left to be reduced later by follow-on troops. Where tanks could be brought forward, they went to work methodically, putting round after round into embrasures and entry points. Throughout the morning, reports flowed back to Canadian Brigade and Divisional Headquarters. Progress uneven, resistance stiff in certain localities. But the critical detail was clear. Units were reaching, and in some places passing, the positions that German planners had expected to hold the attackers for much longer. On the far side of the line, in German command posts, the first indications were unsettling rather than catastrophic. References to lost bunkers, gaps forced in minefields, anti-tank guns silenced by accurate shelling. Yet taken together, they hinted at a pattern that did not match pre-battle estimates. The Hitler line was not grinding the assault to a halt. It was absorbing blows, bending in places, and beginning, in certain sectors opposite the Canadians, to open. The Battle of the Liri Valley was entering its critical phase, when a series of local penetrations would either be contained and sealed, or expand into a breach too wide and too fast for the defenders to control. As the morning wore on, the separate thrusts of the Canadian assault began to link together. In some sectors, individual companies still struggled in front of stubborn strongpoints. A pillbox here, a well-sighted machine gun nest there, pinned down platoons and inflicted the kind of losses the Hitler line was designed to cause. But elsewhere, gaps were widening. Minefields that had been mapped as neat rectangles were found to have seams. Anti-tank ditches, carefully dug and recorded, were crossed with improvised means or bypassed where the ground allowed. The crucial factor was momentum. Once the first wave of infantry had clawed its way through the outworks, follow-on units and supporting arms pressed in behind them. Mortar teams set up quickly to provide immediate fire. Anti-tank guns were manhandled forward to guard against counterattacks. Tanks edged through cleared lanes, their commanders scanning for the low silhouettes of German guns and the edges of surviving positions. On the German side, the incoming reports no longer described a single coherent front. Messages from company and battalion positions spoke of Canadian troops already behind certain bunkers, of anti-tank guns knocked out by direct hits or abandoned when their crews were killed. In other places, telephone lines stayed silent, not because all was well, but because wires had been cut and runners had not returned. Headquarters officers tried to make sense of it. Earlier assumptions had been that any Allied breach would be narrow, perhaps a battalion front, which could be sealed with reserves and counterattacks. Instead, what emerged from the jumble of messages was a more unsettling picture. Multiple penetrations, some shallow, some already deeper than anticipated, spread along a sector held by formations that were themselves already worn by previous fighting. Attempts to organize immediate counterattacks ran into the same problems the attackers had planned to create. Assembly points were under artillery fire. Moving reserves across open ground invited punishment from Allied guns and aircraft. Units intended to plug a gap found themselves harassed and delayed before they could even reach their start lines. Meanwhile, Canadian forces were exploiting every foothold. In certain areas, infantry had broken through the main obstacle belts and were now advancing into the rear of the Hitler Line's positions, turning bunkers and trenches that had been designed to face forward into liabilities. Tanks that had fought their way through the cleared lanes used their mobility to isolate stubborn strongpoints, cutting them off from mutual support. By midday, the language in some German reports shifted. Terms like holding and repulsed began to give way to phrases indicating withdrawal to secondary positions, or loss of contact with forward elements. The line that had been drawn so confidently on maps, a solid band of defensive symbols across the valley, no longer corresponded to the reality on the ground. For Canadian commanders, the crucial decision was to keep pushing, rather than pausing to reorganize on the captured positions of the Hitler Line. Orders were issued to drive on, to turn local success into a broader rupture. Artillery plans were adjusted to support advances beyond the original objectives. Engineers continued to work behind the leading units, widening gaps and ensuring that more armour and support weapons could pass through without delay. By late in the day, it was clear that in the sector attacked by 1st Canadian Corps, the Hitler Line was no longer functioning as an integrated system. It had been broken into fragments, some still firing, some already overrun, others in the process of being abandoned. For many German officers, the speed of that transformation was the most jarring fact of the day. The line had not eroded over a prolonged, attritional battle. It had been breached, exploited, and rendered untenable in a matter of hours, at least in the vital stretch opposite the Canadian advance. What was meant to be a solid defensive wall had, under the pressure of coordinated infantry, armour, artillery, and engineers, cracked faster than their pre-battle calculations allowed. As evening approached over the Liry Valley, one reality settled on both sides of the front. The Hitler Line, as a defensive idea, had failed to buy the time for which it had been built. When the guns finally fell silent along the Canadian sector of the Liry Valley, the Hitler Line no longer existed as the tidy array of symbols that had once filled German maps. It was now a landscape of smashed concrete, torn wire, and positions either overrun or hastily abandoned. The cost of that transformation was high. In the assault and the fighting that followed, I Canadian Corps suffered significant casualties. Infantry battalions that had stepped off at near full strength ended the day with thinned ranks. Companies counted men lost to mines in the advance, to machine gun bursts in the open approaches, to shell fragments around the captured positions. Tank crews paid their own price, with vehicles knocked out by well-sighted German guns, or crippled by hidden obstacles that had been only partially cleared. Stretcher-bearers moved constantly through the wreckage of the line, picking their way past shattered bunkers and burned-out vehicles. Aid posts, filled with wounded from both sides, brought in under flags of evacuation when the immediate fighting in a pocket had died down. For those who survived, the memory of the Hitler Line was not a line at all, but a series of violent, chaotic encounters in which every few meters seemed to demand a toll. Yet within hours, the scale of what the Canadians had achieved began to be recognized at higher levels. Reports flowed from Corps to Army headquarters, noting that Canadian troops had not only reached their planned objectives on the Hitler Line, but in sectors had pushed beyond them. In official communiques, the breaching of the line was highlighted as a major success of Operation Diadem, opening the Liry Valley to further exploitation and contributing directly to the renewed Allied drive toward Rome. Within 8th Army, the performance of 1st Canadian Corps was singled out. The speed with which they had broken through a heavily fortified position, despite the casualties, confirmed the reputation they had built in previous Italian battles. A corps that could be trusted with difficult, deliberate assaults requiring close cooperation between infantry, armour, artillery and engineers. Decorations and mentions in dispatches would follow in due course. Individual acts of courage, engineers clearing mines under fire, platoons pressing on after losing key leaders, tank crews engaging guns at close range, were noted in citations and war diaries. But even as these honours were recorded, the battle was already being examined from another angle: what the breach meant to the enemy who had believed this line would hold longer than it did. On the German side, the breach of the Hitler line forced a rapid and uncomfortable reassessment. In the days following 23rd of May 1944, surviving units pulled back toward new positions farther up the peninsula. War diaries and after-action reports, where they could be completed amid the movement, tried to explain how a line built with such care had failed to deliver the delay its designers had promised. Some factors were predictable: the weight of the artillery bombardment, the effectiveness of Allied air power, the strain on formations that had already been fighting for months. But within those reports, a recurring theme emerged when describing the sector opposite 1st Canadian Corps: the speed and determination with which the Canadians exploited every weakness in the defensive scheme. German officers noted that once the first gaps were forced, Canadian troops showed little hesitation in pushing through them, despite the dangers of mines and isolated strongpoints. Positions that had been intended to cover one another were turned from the flank or struck from the rear before they could fully reorganize. Bunkers that survived the initial bombardment found themselves engaged not just from the front, but by fire and movement coming from unexpected directions. The line's shortcomings were not purely material. The defensive concept behind the Hitler line had been rooted in the idea that strong, continuous obstacles could slow and channel an attacker long enough for reserves and counterattacks to restore the situation. In practice, against well-coordinated assaults like the one mounted by 1st Canadian Corps, those same obstacles sometimes worked against the defenders. Once communications broke down and certain positions were overrun, other parts of the line found their fields of fire blocked or their withdrawal routes compromised. Strategically, the consequences were immediate. The fall of the Hitler line in the Canadian sector and the pressure applied by other Allied formations along the front made it increasingly difficult for German commanders to stabilize the situation in the Liris Valley. With the defense fractured, they were forced into a series of withdrawals towards subsequent positions closer to Rome, including the so-called Caesar Line. Each step back ceded not just ground, but time. The original purpose of the Hitler Line had been to buy that time, to stretch out the campaign in central Italy, delay the Allied advance, and perhaps ease pressure on other fronts. Instead, its relatively rapid collapse in key areas contributed to the acceleration of the Allied offensive. By early June 1944, Allied forces were entering Rome, and the long, grinding campaign in Italy had moved on to a new phase. For Canadian troops, the battle left a complex legacy. Official histories and post-war analyses would later underline the role of 1st Canadian Corps in breaking the Hitler Line and opening the Liris Valley. German documentation, where it survived, acknowledged the effectiveness of their assault and the difficulty of holding ground against such combined arms attacks. The line that had promised to be a major obstacle had, in the sector where Canadians struck, been overcome faster than many German officers had considered likely. In the decades that followed, veterans from both sides would remember the Hitler Line not as an abstract strategic concept, but as a place of noise, dust, and sudden loss. A line that existed for them in the few violent hours when it was taken, or defended, or abandoned. Those memories form the human thread running beneath the maps and reports, and they frame the broader question the battle left behind. What does the breaching of the Hitler Line tell us about the changing nature of warfare, and about the soldiers who fought across it that day? In the long history of fortified lines, the Hitler Line in the Liris Valley was not the largest, nor the most famous. It was one more attempt to turn terrain, concrete, and geometry into time. In the spring of 1944, German planners believed that time could still be purchased in Italy with ditches, mines, and bunkers carefully arranged across a narrow valley floor. What happened on the 23rd of May showed how quickly that belief was slipping out of date. By then, The armies fighting in Italy had lived through years of adaptation. Infantry units like those of 1st Canadian Corps had been reshaped by each hard lesson. Ortona's street fighting, the winter along the Adriatic, the repeated collisions with German rearguard lines. Their commanders no longer saw a fortified belt as a static obstacle to be battered until it cracked. They saw it as a system that could be disrupted, unbalanced, and forced to fail under the pressure of speed and combined arms. Artillery that once simply pounded targets now walked in carefully measured steps. Engineers did not wait behind the assault. They moved with it. Tanks were no longer held back as a separate arm, but woven into the first day's plan. Radios linked all of them into a single moving front that could adjust as gaps appeared and opportunities opened. Against that, a fixed line, no matter how well drawn, was vulnerable. For the German officers who had trusted the Hitler line, the shock came not just from its fall, but from the pace at which Canadian troops turned theory into reality on the ground. Positions meant to last days were breached, flanked, and overrun within hours. The delay that had been promised did not materialize. In the quiet that followed, the broken bunkers and torn wire of the Liri Valley stood as a reminder of a broader truth. In a war increasingly defined by mobility, coordination, and learning under fire, no wall of concrete could guarantee the future. On the 23rd of May 1944, Canadian soldiers proved that to the men who had believed otherwise, and the Hitler line passed into history as a fortification that failed faster than its designers and its defenders ever expected.